Hey, I'm Paul Rabelais. I'm an estate planning attorney, and this is an important video for families and in particular surviving spouses to watch so that they can be informed and have the information that they need to do what they need to do after they've lost their spouse. Let me give you an example. Real common, doesn't always happen this way, but as couples age, one spouse tends to get maybe sick first, and they may be in and out of the hospital and maybe even go from a hospital to a rehab facility or a nursing home and get rehab. And for a few days, if they go from the hospital to the rehab facility or nursing home, Medicare pays for a certain limited number of days for rehabilitation. And once those days run out, then the patient is on their own to cover that long-term care expense. And for many families, it's a $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 a month expense, and Medicare doesn't cover any of that. So what often happens is, that first spouse kind of gets sick and maybe in and out of the hospital, maybe in and out of rehab, and then that first spouse unfortunately passes away. So now the surviving spouse is there, and there's some things going through the surviving spouse's mind about making sure all the affairs are in order. So the first thing that surviving spouse typically does is maybe a few days or a week or two after their spouse dies, they come into the law office in order to get that, what we call in Louisiana, what other states call a probate, done, because the surviving spouse can't sell the house, can't sell or trade in vehicles, can't access investments that are in the name of the deceased spouse. Sure, if the deceased spouse had an IRA, then the probate isn't necessary for the surviving spouse to obtain ownership of the IRA. But if there's other investments outside of retirement accounts in the name of the deceased spouse, that probate is necessary. Those court orders are necessary for the surviving spouse to get access to those accounts. So surviving spouse comes in the law office, we start the succession. Now, what often doesn't take place that needs to take place, and sometimes I'm sensitive to that surviving spouse, so maybe as we're concluding the probate or succession conversation, I might say something like, you tell me whether this is a conversation that you'd like to have. But oftentimes after a first spouse dies and the surviving spouse is getting all of the affairs settled, many surviving spouses want to have a conversation about how to protect the value of the home, protect the savings from losing it all if that surviving spouse needs to go into a nursing home for long-term care services. So I'm always just kind of sensitive, but I want to make sure the subject at least gets brought up. And for one reason or another, it's like 98% of the time that surviving spouse is like, yeah, I need to know what I need to do. I think that surviving spouse feels a sense of urgency because while both spouses were alive, I think their plan was if one got sick, the other would take care of the sick one and they'd be okay in their home, for the duration. But now that one spouse has died and there's nobody else in the home, there's nobody to take care of that surviving spouse, the surviving spouse, the wheels start turning and they're thinking like, geez, if I need care, I'm going to need to go into a facility and I'm going to have to lose everything that we've saved. So that time after the first spouse dies is often really an ideal time to talk about not only getting the estate of the first to die settled, but also to find out what needs to be done to protect the assets moving forward in the event that the surviving spouse needs long-term care. When you're trying to protect things in the event of a long-term care stay, you gotta have legal programs in place for at least 5 years before you enter the nursing home. So that after that first spouse dies is really kind of the right time, if it hasn't been addressed already, to address that. But when you address it, there's so many things that have to be considered. Not only the relationships of all of the parties involved, but things like probate and succession law, the trust code, the income, capital gains tax, gift and estate tax consequences, the homestead exemption, all those things, the how much control do you want to have or are willing to give up in order to get that kind of protection from nursing home expenses and protecting the estate for the family, both for you and ultimately perhaps your children. So not every lawyer is well versed in all of those subjects. Not not to mention the Medicaid regulations, which is a body of law in itself. So just want to make sure when you're kind of figuring out your do's and don'ts, do have the conversation, do have it with the person who's well-versed in all of those areas to make sure you get it just right, and don't kind of stop at the probate or succession conversation when it's really the ideal time, when it's very efficient, when we can often handle the succession or probate, whatever you want to call it, and engage in that potential elder law or Medicaid planning all at the same time. It's much more efficient than doing one, stopping, and then doing another and getting the family involved again in a whole another series of transactions. Kind of when we can do it all at once, it's just easier, and plus it starts that 5-year clock ticking. So a lot of reasons there when one spouse dies to not only have the probate or succession conversation with the right person, but also look towards the future and have that, how do we protect my assets if I get sick? And then also, how do we avoid needing to go through that court-supervised probate process when the surviving spouse dies? So all of that should be part of that first conversation after a first spouse dies. I know it's tough because you're grieving and you've lost a spouse and all kinds of emotions are going through your head and your heart. And so, but it is an appropriate time. Maybe you could get your children, if you'd want your children involved in that conversation, not a bad idea to get them in on the conversation. Even if they're not local, they can be part of the conversation by conference call or speakerphone. Really easy to do. So those are some thoughts that I have. I'm trying to let people know that when they lose their spouse, as tough as that is, there's some conversations that they need to have to make sure they not only settle the estate, but protect things moving forward. I'm Paul Rabelais. Hope that helps. Maybe if you felt it helpful, you can hit the subscribe button or punch the like button or whatever it is, and we'll go from there. Y'all have a great day.